Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a cold and muddy corner of medieval Europe, where life was measured not by dreams or freedom, but by the ringing of church bells, the weight of wet soil, and the fear of surviving another winter. Tonight's story follows a man named Aldric, a poor peasant born into a world where hunger was ordinary, kindness was rare, and even sleep could feel like hard labor. So dim the lights, settle in, and let the rain fall softly outside as we step into the miserable life of a medieval peasant. The year was 1284, and the village of Brackenholt sat in the shadow of a crumbling stone manor owned by Lord Edric of Vale. From a distance, the village looked peaceful enough. Thin trails of smoke drifted from crooked chimneys. Chickens wandered through muddy lanes. Dogs barked lazily near broken carts. But up close, the place carried the smell of damp straw, spoiled grain, sweat, and sickness. Aldric had lived there all 27 years of his life. He woke before sunrise, every morning not because he wished to, but because the cold forced him awake. His family shared a tiny hut made from wood, mud, and straw that leaked whenever rain touched the roof. The floor beneath him was packed dirt. During storms, the ground softened into sticky muck that clung to bare feet. The hut held only one room. Aldric slept beside his wife Edith, their 2 children, and his aging mother. A small fire pit sat in the center of the room, though most nights there was barely enough wood to keep it burning until dawn. Smoke gathered beneath the roof and stung their eyes while they slept. That morning he woke coughing. Rain tapped against the walls, while wind pushed through cracks in the timber. Beside him, Edith remained asleep beneath a rough wool blanket. Little Martin curled against her chest, while baby Elswythe whimpered softly nearby. Aldric rubbed his face and sat upright. His bones already hurt. Harvest season had ended weeks earlier, but there was never true rest for peasants like him. Lord Edric demanded constant labor. If the fields did not need tending, then fences required repair. If fences stood firm, then roads needed clearing. If roads were clear, taxes had to be gathered, grain measured, or pigs slaughtered. The manor always found another task. Outside, the church bell rang once through the rain. Aldric groaned quietly. That early already? Edith muttered without opening her eyes. He nodded, even though she could barely see him. The reeve wants everyone at the east field today. Edith closed her eyes tighter. The east field drowned last week. Aye, Aldric said, which means we'll spend the day digging trenches through frozen mud. Neither of them spoke after that. There was nothing else to say. Aldric pulled on damp clothes that still smelled of manure from the previous day. His boots had split near the heel months ago, forcing him to wrap cloth around his feet before stepping outside. The cold bit into him immediately. The village looked gray beneath the storm clouds. Thin children wandered barefoot through mud, while women carried buckets from the well. An old man coughed violently near the pig pens. Somewhere farther down the lane, a baby cried without stopping. Nobody smiled in Brackenholt before sunrise. At the center of the village stood the wooden stocks where thieves were punished. A boy barely older than 12 sat, trapped there now, soaked by rain, while villagers ignored him. Someone had tied rotten turnips around his neck. Aldric recognized him. Tobin, the miller's youngest son. Apparently, he had stolen bread from the manor kitchens the night before. Aldric slowed slightly as he passed. The boy's lips trembled from cold. "Please," Tobin whispered weakly. "Please, Aldric." Aldric looked away. Helping him meant punishment for both of them. So he kept walking. That was the cruelest thing about peasant life. Misery never belonged to one person alone. Everyone suffered together, yet fear kept neighbors from helping each other too openly. By the time Aldric reached the east field, nearly 40 villagers had gathered there beneath steady rain. The reeve stood atop a cart shouting instructions while holding a stick like a weapon. The reeve's name was Oswin. He served Lord Edric faithfully and enjoyed reminding peasants of their place. "You lazy swine took too long getting here," Oswin barked. "His lordship expects these trenches dug before nightfall." Several peasants exchanged exhausted looks. The east field stretched endlessly before them, half flooded and covered in dying crops. Mud reached nearly to the ankles. Aldric stepped into it with a sigh. Within moments, icy water soaked through the cloth around his feet. The work began. Hour after hour, they dug trenches using worn wooden spades that barely cut through the earth. Rainwater splashed into their faces. Their hands cracked and bled from cold. Several times Aldric nearly slipped face first into the muck. Nobody spoke much. Conversation wasted energy. Around midday, a cart arrived carrying food from the manor kitchens. Each worker received a small chunk of black bread and watered ale. The bread tasted sour and hard enough to break teeth. Still, everyone ate quickly. Aldric sat beside an older peasant named Bertram, whose beard carried flecks of mud. Bertram stared across the drowned field. "You hear about the northern villages?" he asked quietly. Aldric shook his head. Fever spread there before winter. Bertram swallowed slowly. Half the people dead already. Aldric frowned. What kind of fever? The bloody kind. Several workers nearby crossed themselves after hearing that. In medieval villages, disease traveled like smoke through dry grass. One bad season could erase entire families before spring arrived. Aldric chewed silently. His daughter had coughed for days now. He tried not to think about it. By late afternoon, the rain finally weakened, though the cold only sharpened. Clouds shifted enough to reveal the distant manor on the hill. Lord Edric's home looked like another world compared to Brackenholt. Stone walls, glass windows, warm fires, servants, while peasants fought over moldy grain. The Lord hosted feasts beneath candlelight. Aldric sometimes wondered what it felt like to sleep without hunger. He doubted he would ever know. As evening approached, Oswin inspected the trenches with narrowed eyes. "Not deep enough," he snapped. Groans spread through the workers. "We've been here since dawn." One woman protested weakly. Oswin struck her shoulder with the stick. "Then dig faster." Nobody dared interfere. The woman lowered her head and returned to work, while tears mixed with rainwater on her face. Aldric felt anger burn briefly inside him. But anger meant nothing here. A peasant could not eat anger, could not trade it for firewood, could not protect children with it. So like everyone else, he buried the feeling and kept digging. Darkness had already fallen by the time they were finally dismissed. Aldric's back screamed with pain as he limped toward the village. Smoke rose from huts, while dogs barked somewhere in the gloom. The stocks still stood near the center lane. Tobin remained trapped inside. No one had released him. His head drooped weakly now. Aldric slowed again. The boy looked half frozen. For several seconds, Aldric stood there wrestling with himself. Then quietly, making certain nobody watched, he pulled a small crust of leftover bread from his pocket and slipped it beside Tobin's hand. The boy stared at him with wide eyes. Aldric said nothing. He simply walked away before fear could stop him. When he entered his hut, warmth barely existed inside. Edith stirred thin cabbage stew over the fire while the children slept nearby. "That all?" Aldric asked softly after seeing the pot. "It's the last cabbage," Edith replied. Aldric sat heavily beside the flames. The stew tasted mostly of dirty water. Still, it eased the ache in his stomach slightly. After supper, Edith spoke quietly while staring into the fire. "The tax collector came today." Aldric closed his eyes. "How much?" "2 more silver pennies before month's end." He almost laughed. 2 silver pennies may as well have been a king's ransom. "We barely survived autumn taxes," he muttered. Edith nodded slowly. "If we fail, they'll take the goat." Silence settled between them. The goat was everything. Milk for the children, cheese when possible, trade at market. Without it, winter would become far deadlier. Outside, wind rattled the walls again. Aldric looked toward his sleeping children. Martin's ribs showed through his thin shirt, even while asleep. Elswythe coughed softly beside him. The sound chilled Aldric more deeply than the storm outside ever could. That night's sleep came slowly. Rain returned after midnight, drumming against the roof, while cold seeped through every crack in the hut. Aldric lay awake, listening to the village beyond the darkness. A distant dog barked. Someone shouted drunkenly near the alehouse. Then somewhere far off, another sound echoed through the storm. Church bells, not the usual morning bells. These rang slowly. 3 times, Aldric opened his eyes. Beside him, Edith stirred uneasily. "What is it?" she whispered. He listened carefully. The bells stopped. For several moments, only rain remained. Then came hurried footsteps outside. Voices. A woman crying somewhere down the lane. Aldric sat upright. Something had happened in Brackenholt, and by dawn, the village would learn that winter's true misery had only just begun. Morning arrived beneath a sky, the color of wet ash. Aldric had barely slept an hour before fists hammered against doors throughout Brackenholt. Men shouted outside, while nervous dogs barked themselves hoarse. The church bell rang again and again, not with the slow rhythm of prayer, but with the sharp panic used only during disaster. Edith sat upright immediately. What happened? Aldric was already pulling on his boots. "I don't know." Another scream echoed from somewhere near the center lane. The children woke crying as cold air pushed through the hut. Edith wrapped them tightly beneath blankets while Aldric stepped outside into the freezing dawn. The village had gathered near the well. People stood half-dressed beneath the bitter wind, whispering nervously while smoke drifted low over the rooftops. Several women clutched rosary beads. Others crossed themselves repeatedly, as if afraid God had finally abandoned Brackenholt entirely. Aldric pushed through the crowd. Then he saw why everyone looked terrified. Taubin was dead. The miller's son still sat trapped in the stocks, his head hanging unnaturally forward, rainwater dripping from tangled hair. His skin had turned pale blue during the night. Someone had covered his shoulders with an old sackcloth, though it did little to hide the horror of it. A few villagers quietly wept. Most simply stared. Aldric felt something heavy settle inside his chest. He remembered the crust of bread beside the boy's hand. Untouched, Father Dunric stood nearby muttering prayers, while Oswin the Reeve barked at villagers to return to work. "Enough standing around," Oswin shouted. The boy stole from the manor. His punishment was lawful. He was 12, someone muttered from the crowd. Oswin glared toward the voice. "And now he's dead. Let that remind the rest of you what happens to thieves." No one answered him. In Brackenholt, people learned early that justice and cruelty often wore the same face. Aldric noticed Taubin's mother kneeling in the mud nearby. She made no sound at all. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks, while two women tried to pull her away from the body. The silence frightened him more than screaming would have. He turned away. Winter had not even fully begun, and already death sat in the village square. By sunrise, the fields called them again. Lord Edric's steward arrived from the manor, carrying new orders. Several oxen had died from sickness during the previous week, and now peasants were expected to pull supply carts themselves until replacements could be bought. The announcement spread misery through the village like poison. Men who could barely stand after harvest were now expected to haul timber through frozen roads. Aldric joined 6 others beside a heavy wooden cart loaded with stones meant for repairing the manor walls. Thick ropes were tied across their shoulders. Oswin watched them with satisfaction. "Move," he ordered. The cart barely shifted. Mud sucked at the wheels, while cold rain softened the road into sludge. Aldric leaned forward with every ounce of strength he possessed. Pain shot through his legs instantly. Beside him, Bertram coughed violently into the crook of his arm. "You all right?" Aldric muttered. Bertram nodded weakly, but his face looked gray. They dragged the cart inch by inch up the road toward the manor hill. Sweat soaked through their clothes despite the freezing wind. Their breath rose like smoke around them. Halfway there, one of the younger peasants stumbled. The cart rolled backward suddenly. Everyone shouted. Aldric nearly lost his footing before several men jammed stones beneath the wheels. Oswin struck the fallen boy across the back with his stick. "Worthless animal," he snapped. The boy could not have been older than 16. Blood trickled from his lip as he struggled upright again. Aldric clenched his jaw so tightly it hurt. But once more he said nothing. Silence kept people alive here. The manor loomed larger as they climbed. Up close, it looked even crueler somehow. Bright banners hung from stone towers, while smoke curled warmly from massive chimneys. Servants moved through the courtyard, carrying baskets of fresh bread. The smell drifted toward the exhausted peasants below. Warm bread, roasted meat, ale. Aldric's stomach twisted painfully. For one dangerous moment, he imagined storming through the gates and stealing enough food to feed Brackenholt for a month. But fantasies belonged to fools. Men were hanged for far less. Inside the courtyard, they unloaded the stones beneath the steward's watchful eyes. Several guards stood nearby, wearing thick wool cloaks and polished boots. One guard laughed quietly while observing the mud-covered peasants. "They look more like corpses every season," he joked. Another guard smirked. "Aye, easier to bury come spring." The peasants pretended not to hear. Before leaving, Aldric caught sight of Lord Edric himself, standing near an upper balcony. The lord wore dark fur around his shoulders and held a silver goblet in one hand. He never looked directly at the workers. To him, they were tools, no different from oxen, maybe less valuable. The journey back to Brackenholt felt longer. Snow had begun falling lightly now, thin white flakes, disappearing into mud before they could settle. Bertram lagged farther behind with every mile. Finally, he stopped walking altogether. The others turned. Bertram bent forward, coughing violently. One hand pressed against his chest. Dark blood splattered into the snow. Everyone froze. The bloody fever. Aldric felt sudden ice crawl through his stomach. Oswin stepped backward immediately. No one touch him. Bertram looked up weakly. "Please," he rasped. Blood stained his beard now. The peasants exchanged frightened glances. Everyone knew what fever meant. Whole villages had vanished from it before. Oswin pointed toward the roadside ditch. Leave him. Bertram stared in disbelief. Aldric, the sound of his name, nearly broke something inside him. For years, they had worked side by side in the fields, shared bread, shared misery. Now the reeve wanted him abandoned, like dead livestock. Oswin's voice hardened. That sickness reaches the village, and Lord Edric loses workers. Move on. Bertram coughed again, weaker this time. Snowflakes landed softly against the blood near his boots. Aldric stepped forward, instinctively. Oswin grabbed his shoulder. You want the fever too. The others watched silently. Fear ruled every face. Bertram slowly sank to his knees in the snow. No one moved to help him. After several terrible seconds, Aldric forced himself to continue walking with the others. His legs felt numb beneath him. Behind them, Bertram's coughing faded into the wind. Nobody spoke during the rest of the journey. That silence followed Aldric all the way home. When he entered the hut that evening, Edith immediately noticed something wrong. What happened? Aldric sat near the fire, without answering at first. The flames looked weak tonight, nearly dead. Finally, he spoke quietly. Bertram got the bloody fever. Edith's expression tightened instantly. Did he come near the village? No. That single word carried enough guilt to choke him. Edith understood immediately. Neither spoke for a while after that. Outside, the snow thickened steadily. Winter had arrived early. That night, the village barred doors before darkness fully fell. Fear spread faster than sickness itself. Mothers kept children indoors. Men avoided gathering near the alehouse. Even the dogs seemed quieter than usual. Aldric tried eating supper, but every bite tasted like ash. He kept seeing Bertram kneeling beside the road. Please, Aldric. Later, while the children slept, Edith sat beside him, repairing torn clothing by firelight. Do you remember summer fairs? She asked suddenly. Aldric blinked. What? When we were younger. Her tired eyes remained fixed on the needle. Before Martin was born, before the bad harvests, Aldric thought for a moment. He barely remembered joy anymore. But slowly, fragments returned. Music near the river, honey cakes, dancing beside lanterns, people laughing without fear. He said softly. Edith smiled faintly. It feels like another life. Maybe it was. Years of hunger changed people more deeply than age ever could. A sudden knock hit the door. Both froze instantly. Another knock followed. Then another. 3 knocks. Slow, heavy. Aldric rose carefully. Outside, wind howled through the lane, while snow scraped against the walls. Edith clutched the children close. Who is it? Aldric called. For a moment, there was no answer. Then a weak voice came through the storm. Please. Aldric recognized it immediately. Bertram. Edith's face went pale. Aldric moved toward the door instinctively. But Edith grabbed his arm hard enough to hurt. If he carries the fever, he'll die out there. He'll die anyway. The words hung painfully between them. Outside came another weak knock. Please. Aldric stared at the wooden door, while every terrible choice in the world seemed to gather before him at once. Open it and risk killing his family. Leave it shut and condemn a friend to freeze outside alone. The knocking grew weaker, then stopped entirely. Only the wind remained. Aldric stood frozen beside the door long after the knocking stopped. The wind scraped snow against the walls with a dry, whispering sound. Inside the hut, the fire crackled weakly, throwing uneven shadows across Edith's frightened face. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed loudly. Outside, silence spread across the lane. Edith still gripped his sleeve. Don't, she whispered. Aldric stared at the wooden latch. Every instinct inside him screamed to open the door. But behind him slept Martin and little Elswithe, curled beneath patched blankets, thin shoulders rising softly with each breath. Family, friend, duty, fear, the miserable arithmetic of peasant life. Finally, slowly, Aldric stepped away from the door. No words passed between him and Edith after that. They sat awake through most of the night, listening to winter tighten its grip around Brackenholt. Sleep, when it finally came, felt heavy and cruel. At dawn, Aldric opened the door. Snow covered the lane in a thin white blanket. The cold struck him immediately. For a brief second he hoped, absurdly, desperately, that Bertram had somehow found shelter elsewhere. But the shape beside the wall ended that hope. Bertram lay curled beneath drifting snow, one arm stretched toward the door he had never entered. His face looked strangely peaceful now. Too peaceful. Aldric knelt slowly beside him. The body was stiff with cold. Snow rested along his beard. One boot was missing. He must have wandered half the night before collapsing here. Aldric closed his eyes. Behind him, Edith appeared quietly at the doorway, holding Martin close against her chest. Neither of them spoke. What words could possibly improve this? Within an hour, the village knew. News moved quickly through Brackenholt. Some crossed themselves. Some muttered that sickness had finally arrived. Others blamed Bertram himself for coming near homes after dark. Fear made people crueler than hunger sometimes. Father Tunrick ordered the body moved immediately. No burial service, no gathering, no touching. 2 frightened men wrapped Bertram in rough cloth, using long wooden poles to avoid direct contact. Aldric helped, not because anyone ordered him to, because somebody had to. Oswin watched from several paces away. Take him beyond the eastern boundary, the reeve instructed. Far from the well, like spoiled meat, like an animal carcass. Aldric's jaw tightened. They carried Bertram toward a frozen patch of ground beyond the village fields, where poor burials often happened during harsh winters. The earth had hardened nearly to stone already. Digging proved miserable. Their spades struck frozen soil again and again, while cold wind cut through clothing. One man cursed quietly. The grave barely reached proper depth. It would have to do, as they lowered Bertram into the ground. Aldric remembered summer evenings years earlier. Bertram laughing beside the alehouse. Bertram teaching Martin how to carve wooden whistles. Bertram sharing onions during a famine year when nobody shared anything. Now the earth swallowed him in silence. No bell rang. No prayers lingered. Only cold. When Aldric returned home near midday, Edith had news waiting. The steward came. His stomach tightened instantly. What now? Winter levy. Of course. Always another levy. Always another demand. Edith handed him a small wooden token stamped with the Lord's seal. All households owe grain or coin before the feast of St. Matthias. Aldrich stared at it. They barely had enough food to survive until spring. A winter levy might as well have been a death sentence, wrapped in official language. We've nothing left, he muttered. Edith avoided his eyes. I know. Outside, church bells sounded once through falling snow. Somewhere nearby, a child cried loudly enough to carry through the village. Aldrich sank onto the stool near the fire and rubbed his face. Exhaustion sat inside his bones now, not the simple tiredness from labor. Something deeper, the kind that slowly convinced a man nothing would ever improve. Edith stirred thin oat porridge over the fire. That's the last of the oats, she said quietly. He nodded without responding. Words were becoming expensive things in their household. That afternoon, Oswin arrived personally. The Reeve rarely visited homes, unless trouble followed behind him. Aldrich stepped outside to meet him. Snow drifted through the lane, while Oswin consulted a parchment roll. Inspection tomorrow. Aldrich frowned. Inspection. Livestock assessment. The meaning landed immediately. Taxes. Again. Lord Edric assessed animals before winter to calculate dues. Goats, pigs, chickens, anything remotely valuable became an excuse for another payment. Oswin's eyes shifted toward the small shed behind the hut. You still have the goat. Aldrich hesitated half a second too long. The Reeve noticed. I, Oswin said slowly, make certain it remains healthy. Then he walked away. Aldrich watched him disappear through falling snow. Dread settled heavily inside him. That goat was their lifeline. Without its milk, Elswythe would weaken quickly. Without trade from cheese or future offspring, survival narrowed sharply. Inside the hut, Edith read his expression immediately. He knows about the goat. She lowered her eyes. Neither needed to say the rest aloud. That evening hunger lingered around the family, like another unseen occupant inside the hut. Martin complained of stomach pains before sleep. Little Elswythe's cough sounded worse, a dry, persistent sound. Aldric tried ignoring it. Failed. Later, after darkness deepened, he stepped outside for air. The village looked ghostly beneath snowlight. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Most windows remained dark. Winter always shrank life inward. People disappeared into their huts, like frightened animals conserving warmth. Near the well, Aldric noticed movement. A small figure, Tobin's mother. She knelt alone in the snow. For a moment, he thought she prayed. Then he realized she was scraping frozen mud near the base of the stalks. Searching, he approached slowly. Myra. She startled slightly, but did not rise. In her hands, she held tiny bread crumbs. Old crumbs, frozen into the mud. Aldric's chest tightened. The crust he had slipped to Tobin days earlier. She looked up at him with hollow eyes. He never ate it, she said softly. Aldric could not answer. Her fingers closed gently around the crumbs. He was hungry all the time, she whispered. Always hungry. Snow gathered across her shoulders while she spoke. Sometimes he'd pretend he was. Said he wanted me to eat instead. Aldric looked toward the abandoned stalks. The wood still carried faint dark stains from weather and suffering alike. Mara's voice grew quieter. Do you know what frightens me most? He shook his head. I'm starting to forget his laugh. The words struck harder than any Reeves stick, because that was the true horror of village misery, not simply death. Forgetting, the slow erosion of faces, voices, small, ordinary moments. Aldric stood with her a while, beneath the snow. No wisdom came to him, no comforting speech. Eventually, she rose and walked away, carrying frozen bread crumbs in her palm, as though they were sacred relics. That night, the storm worsened. Wind battered Brackenholt relentlessly. The hut creaked under violent gusts, while snow forced itself through gaps in the walls. Around midnight, Elswythe's coughing changed. Harsher now. Wet. Edith sat upright immediately. Aldric leaned closer, beside the dim firelight. Their daughter's forehead burned beneath his hand. Too warm. Far too warm. Edith's face tightened with fear. No. Elswythe coughed again, struggling for breath. Aldric felt panic bloom coldly through his chest. Not fever. Please, not fever. Edith wrapped the child carefully in blankets, while murmuring prayers beneath her breath. The tiny hut suddenly felt smaller, the cold sharper, the future narrower. By dawn, Elswythe could barely keep food down. Father Dunrick knew simple remedies, but medicine in Brackenholt amounted mostly to herbs, superstition, and desperate hope. Still, Aldric prepared to fetch him. Before he could leave, shouting erupted outside. Voices, angry voices. He stepped into the lane. Villagers crowded near the northern huts. Snow swirled around them, while men argued loudly. Aldric pushed forward. At the center stood Oswin. Beside him were 2 manor guards, and between them, their goat, bound by a rope. Edith appeared behind Aldric. Horror spreading across her face. Oswin unfolded a parchment calmly. "Unpaid obligations," he announced. "By authority of Lord Edric, this animal is seized against outstanding dues." "No," Edith breathed. Aldric stepped forward immediately. "You can't take her." "I can. She's all we have." Oswin shrugged. "Then, perhaps, you should have been born wealthier." Several villagers lowered their eyes. Nobody intervened. Nobody ever did. The goat bleated nervously while the guards tightened the rope. Martin burst from the hut crying, "Don't take Daisy." One guard laughed quietly. Aldric felt something inside him snap tight. Not loud rage, not shouting, something colder. Months of hunger, years of humiliation. Bertram in the snow, Tobin in the stocks, his daughter burning with fever behind him, the goat pulling desperately against the rope. Oswin turned casually to leave, and for the first time in his life, Aldric did not step back. Snow whipped through the lane as Aldric planted himself directly in front of Oswin. The reeve stopped walking. For a brief moment, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind sounded distant. Oswin stared at him with open disbelief, as though a mule had suddenly begun speaking. "You'll move," the reeve said calmly. Aldric did not. Behind him, Edith clutched Elswith tightly beneath blankets, while Martin cried beside the doorway. Villagers watched from windows and muddy lanes, their faces pale with fear. No peasant blocked the reeve. Not in Brackenholt. Not if they wished to keep breathing freely. But Aldric remained where he stood. "That goat stays," he said quietly. One of the guards barked a short laugh. Oswin's expression hardened. "You forget your place." "No," Aldric replied. "I remember it too well." The words slipped out before caution could stop them. Several villagers lowered their heads immediately. Others backed away slightly, as if violence itself might spread through the snow. Oswin stepped closer until their faces nearly touched. "You owe grain. You owe silver. His lordship claims payment." "My daughter's sick," Aldric said. "Without milk she'll die." The reeve's eyes remained empty. "Then bury her when the ground softens." Edith gasped softly behind him. Something terrible moved through Aldric then. Not bravery, not heroism, just exhaustion so deep that fear finally had nowhere left to live. The guard holding the goat jerked the rope again. Daisy bleated sharply. Martin cried louder. And suddenly, Aldric grabbed the rope. The movement shocked everyone. The guard swore and pulled backward immediately. But Aldric held fast with both hands. Mud and snow churned beneath their boots, while the goat panicked between them. Oswin struck Aldric across the face with his stick. Pain exploded through his cheek. Still, he did not let go. The second guard rushed forward and drove a fist into Aldric's stomach hard enough to steal his breath. He doubled over, but kept one hand wrapped around the rope. Villagers stared in stunned silence. No one had seen a peasant resist manor authority in years. maybe decades. Oswin hit him again, this time across the temple. Aldric collapsed into the snow. The guard ripped the rope free. Edith screamed his name. Martin tried running toward the goat, but a nearby woman grabbed the boy before he could reach the guards. Blood dripped warmly down the side of Aldric's face, while snowflakes landed against his skin. He looked upward through blurred vision. The villagers were watching him differently now, not with admiration, with terror, because everyone understood what came next. Oswin stood over him, breathing heavily. "You stupid animal," he muttered. The reeve motioned toward the guards. "Take him." 2 men dragged Aldric upright by the arms, while Edith rushed forward desperately. "Please," she begged. "Please, he didn't mean." Oswin shoved her backward. He attacked manor authority. He only wanted silence. Elswythe coughed weakly from Edith's arms. The sound barely reached above the wind. Oswin looked toward the gathered villagers. "Let this remind all of you what rebellion earns." Then they dragged Aldric through the snow toward the manor hill. No one stopped them. No one could. The journey felt unreal. Blood dripped from Aldric's nose onto the frozen road, while the guards pulled him forward. His wrists burned beneath rough rope bindings. Behind him, Brackenholt slowly disappeared into snowfall. His home, his children, Edith standing in the lane, clutching their feverish daughter. He kept seeing her face over and over. The manor gates opened with a heavy groan as they arrived. Inside the courtyard, warmth glowed from high windows, while servants hurried between buildings, carrying baskets of food and armfuls of firewood. Life continued comfortably here. Aldric was dragged not toward the main hall, but beneath it. The manor prison sat partially underground. Stone steps led downward into darkness, thick with damp air and rot. The smell struck first. Urine, mold, old straw, human misery trapped beneath stone. A guard unlocked a heavy wooden door and shoved Aldric inside. He crashed hard against wet floorboards. The cell measured barely 6 paces across. Chains hung from one wall. Water dripped steadily somewhere in the darkness. Before the door slammed shut, Oswin crouched outside the bars. "You should have bowed your head," he said quietly. Then he left. Darkness swallowed the cell completely. For a long time, Aldric simply lay there listening to his own breathing. Pain spread through every part of him now. His ribs ached sharply. One eye had begun swelling closed. The cold inside the dungeon felt different from winter cold. Deader somehow. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Down there time lost shape. Eventually, a voice emerged from the darkness beside him. "You fought them." Aldric jerked slightly. In the far corner sat another prisoner he had not seen before. An old man wrapped in torn wool, thin as bone. Aldric squinted through gloom. "Who are you?" The old man coughed before answering. "Used to be called Rowan. Used to be," as though names mattered little down here. What are you here for? Aldric asked. Rowan laughed softly. The sound carried no humor at all. Tax debt. He lifted one chained wrist slightly. Same as most. Aldric leaned back against the wall slowly. How long? Stopped counting. Silence settled again. Water dripped steadily nearby. Above them, faint footsteps echoed through the manor floors. Warm people, fed people, people who would never see this dungeon. Rowan studied Aldric through the darkness. You've got children. Aldric nodded. A son and daughter. The old man looked away. I had 3. Had. Aldric swallowed carefully. What happened? One starved during the long rains. Rowan's voice remained strangely calm. One froze crossing the river years later. My eldest joined soldiers during the Welsh campaigns. He shrugged weakly. Never returned. Aldric closed his eyes. Medieval life consumed people piece by piece, until grief became ordinary conversation. Hours later, a servant finally appeared carrying a wooden bowl. Inside floated thin onion broth. The servant slid it through the bars. Without speaking, Aldric devoured it, immediately despite the foul taste. Hunger erased pride quickly. Afterward, exhaustion dragged heavily at him. But sleep proved impossible. He kept imagining Edith alone, Elswythe burning with fever, Martin crying as the goat disappeared. The helplessness hurt worse than the beating. At some point during the night, screaming echoed faintly through distant corridors. A woman screaming, then abruptly silence. Aldric stared into darkness afterward, unable to stop trembling. What was that? He whispered. Rowan did not answer immediately. Finally he muttered, best not to ask. Morning came only because pale gray light eventually filtered weakly through a tiny slit high in the wall. Aldric's entire body felt stiff and swollen. Outside the cell, 2 guards argued quietly. 3 dead already, one muttered. The fever. Lie. Aldric's stomach tightened instantly. Brackenholt. Had it reached the village already? The guards moved away before he could hear more. Later that afternoon, the cell door opened again. Oswin entered, carrying a parchment. He looked mildly irritated. Lord Edric has decided against hanging you. Aldric said nothing. Instead, Oswin continued. You'll repay damages through labor. What labor? The reeve smiled thinly. The northern quarry. Rowan went visibly still in the corner. Even Aldric had heard stories about the quarry. Hard labor camps carved into frozen hills several miles north of the manor. Men worked their cutting stone until exhaustion or injury killed them. Few returned healthy. Some never returned at all. I need to go home, Aldric said immediately. My daughter's sick. Oswin ignored him. You leave at sunrise. Aldric stepped forward, desperately. Please. The reeve paused at the doorway. For one brief moment, Aldric thought perhaps some shred of mercy existed beneath the man's cold face. Then Oswin spoke. Mercy is expensive, peasant. The door slammed shut again. Rowan stared silently at the floor after Oswin left. Finally, he muttered, "The quarry buries men faster than churchyards." Aldric sank slowly against the wall. He felt trapped inside a nightmare built from mud, snow, and stone. And somewhere beyond those walls, his family faced winter alone. That night, the dungeon felt colder than before. Aldric sat with his back against the damp wall, while thin gray moonlight slipped through the narrow slit above. Every breath drifted visibly through the air. Somewhere deeper beneath the manor, water echoed through unseen tunnels with a hollow sound that never fully stopped. Rowan slept fitfully in the corner, coughing every so often beneath torn blankets. Aldric could not sleep at all. His thoughts remained trapped inside Brackenholt. He imagined Edith trying to calm Elswythe's fever beside the dying fire. He imagined Martin asking when his father would return. Worst of all, he imagined Oswin's men coming again for more taxes, while his family had nothing left to surrender. He pressed both hands against his face. For years, he had endured quietly. The hunger, the humiliation, the endless labor. Like every peasant, he believed survival meant obedience. But obedience had taken the goat anyway. Obedience had left Bertram frozen outside a door. Obedience had killed a starving boy in the stocks. And now obedience sat uselessly in a prison cell. Somewhere far above, laughter echoed faintly through the manor hall. A feast. Aldric stared upward bitterly. The smell arrived a moment later. Roasted meat, fresh bread, wine. It drifted down through cracks in the stone like a cruel reminder that another world existed only a few floors above him. Rowan opened one eye. Winter banquet, the old man muttered. Aldric said nothing. They do it every year, Rowan continued weakly. Music, hunting stories, dancing. He coughed into his sleeve. Once, long ago, I carried barrels into the great hall during one of them. Aldric looked over. What was it like? Rowan gave a thin smile. Bright, just that single word. Bright, as though warmth itself belonged only to nobles. The old man closed his eyes again. Never saw so many candles. Hours passed slowly afterward. Eventually, exhaustion dragged Aldric into shallow sleep, filled with restless dreams. He dreamed of Brackenholt, buried entirely beneath snow. No smoke rose from the huts. No voices remained. Only white silence stretching across empty fields. Then he saw Elswythe, standing alone near the frozen well. She looked healthy again, smiling, but when she opened her mouth, Bertram's voice came out instead. Please let me in. Aldric woke violently. His heart hammered against his ribs. The dungeon remained dark and freezing. Rowan still slept nearby. For several moments, Aldric simply breathed hard, while sweat cooled against his skin. Then somewhere above them, a bell rang once. Morning. The quarrymen arrived shortly after after sunrise. 3 guards unlocked the cell, while another carried iron shackles. "On your feet," one barked. Rowan remained curled in the corner. The guards ignored him entirely. Aldric stood slowly despite aching muscles. The shackles closed around his wrists with a heavy metallic snap. Cold iron bit into his skin immediately. Outside, snow covered the manor courtyard in pale gray drifts. More prisoners waited there already. 6 men total, all thin, all exhausted. One looked barely older than Martin would be in another decade. Another limped badly on a swollen ankle. None spoke much. A cart waited near the gates, carrying mining tools and chains. Oswin stood nearby, reviewing names from a parchment. When his eyes met Aldric's, no emotion showed there at all. Just business. The gates creaked open. The journey north began. The road toward the quarry climbed through barren hills, where winter wind howled endlessly across open ground. Snow whipped against their faces, while the prisoners trudged forward in chains. 2 guards rode horses behind them, carrying spears. Another walked ahead with a lantern despite daylight. For the sky remained dark, with thick storm clouds. Hours passed. No one complained. Complaints wasted breath. Eventually, the youngest prisoner stumbled into the snow. A guard kicked him hard between the shoulders. "Up!" The boy struggled upright silently. Aldric watched him carefully afterward. The boy's cheeks looked sunken from hunger, lips cracked from cold, maybe 17 at most. During a short stop near midday, Aldric quietly offered him part of the stale bread ration guards had distributed earlier. The boy hesitated before accepting. "Thank you," he whispered. "What's your name?" "Hugh." Aldric nodded. "What brought you here?" Hugh stared at the snow while chewing slowly. "My father stole flour." Aldric closed his eyes briefly. Punishment rarely stopped with one person. Families carried guilt together. By late afternoon, the quarry finally appeared beyond the hills. Aldric immediately understood why men feared it. The place looked less like a work camp and more like an open wound carved into the earth. Massive stone pits descended into darkness beneath steep, frozen cliffs. Wooden scaffolds clung dangerously to the rock walls, while workers moved below like tiny insects through drifting snow. Hammering echoed constantly, sharp metallic sounds against stone. Smoke rose from crude huts built near the pits. Thin smoke, poor fires. A tall man wearing wolf fur approached as the prisoners entered the camp. His face carried a thick scar from ear to chin. "The new ones?" he asked. One guard nodded. The scarred man looked them over slowly. "Half of them won't last the month." Then he laughed. The sound chilled Aldric more than the wind. "This is Master Corvin," a guard announced. "You obey him, or you get buried in the quarry itself." Corvin stepped closer to Aldric. "You're the one who fought the Reeve." Word traveled fast. Aldric said nothing. Corvin grinned slightly. kind either dies quick or survives longer than expected. He pointed toward the pit below. Welcome to your new life. The prisoners were led to the worker huts before nightfall. The buildings barely deserved the name. Long wooden structures packed with straw pallets and crowded bodies. The smell inside nearly overwhelmed Aldric immediately. Sweat, blood, rotting boots, wet wool, sickness. Men coughed constantly in the darkness, while others lay motionless beneath blankets. A one-eyed worker pointed toward an empty corner. Sleep there. Aldric sat carefully onto the straw. It felt damp beneath him. Nearby, Hugh curled against the wall, shivering violently. No fire burned inside the hut. Fuel was considered too valuable for prisoners. After sunset, they received supper. Watery turnip stew, black bread hard as stone. Still, men devoured every crumb. Hunger made even misery precious. As Aldric ate, conversations drifted quietly through the hut. Another collapse yesterday. Heard they buried 3 men where they fell. Grounds unstable near the lower pit. Doesn't matter. Corvin keeps sending workers down. Aldric listened silently. Across the room, an older miner noticed him. First winter here. Aldric nodded. The miner snorted softly. Pray for spring. Later that night, long after most workers slept, Aldric lay awake, staring into darkness. The wind outside screamed across the quarry cliffs. Every few moments, distant hammering still echoed from somewhere below, where night crews continued cutting stone beneath torchlight. No escape seemed possible here. Snow surrounded the camp for miles. Guards watched constantly, and even if a man fled successfully, where would he go? Back to debts, back to starvation, back to lords and reeves and taxes. Aldric suddenly realized something horrifying. The quarry was not truly different from village life, only more honest. Both places consumed peasants until nothing remained. Sometime near dawn, shouting erupted outside. Men jolted awake instantly. A bell clanged rapidly through the camp. Corvin's voice thundered somewhere beyond the hut. Move. Workers scrambled from straw beds, while guards kicked open doors. Aldric rose quickly. Snow blew violently outside now. Torchlight flickered across frightened faces. One of the lower quarry walls had collapsed during the night. Several miners remained trapped beneath stone. Corvin pointed toward ropes and tools. All hands down the pit. A worker near Aldric muttered under his breath, "They'll kill us all before winter ends." Then the men descended into the quarry darkness, while snow swirled above them like ash falling from the sky. The climb into the lower quarry pit felt like descending into the mouth of the earth itself. Ropes creaked beneath the workers' weight, while icy wind howled between the cliffs above. Torchlight flickered wildly against wet stone walls, throwing long shadows across the narrow paths carved into the rock. Aldric kept one hand tightly around the frozen rope as he descended. Below him, the quarry opened into darkness. The air changed there. Colder, heavier, dust mixed with the smell of damp earth and sweat. Somewhere, beneath the crashing wind, came muffled cries echoing through the pit. The trapped miners. "Hurry," Corvin shouted from above. "If they suffocate before we reach them, you'll answer for it." The men exchanged bitter looks. Even dying workers were treated like damaged tools. When Aldric finally reached the bottom, he understood the scale of the collapse. An entire section of stone wall had given way during the night, burying part of the tunnel beneath enormous slabs of rock. Broken scaffolding jutted from the debris like snapped bones. Several miners were already digging desperately with shovels and bare hands. Blood stained the snow-covered rubble. Aldric joined them immediately. The stone felt impossibly heavy. Hours blurred together as they hauled rock after rock away from the collapse site. Hands split open. Nails cracked. Men coughed constantly from dust filling the air. At one point, they uncovered a crushed arm protruding from beneath a slab. The arm did not move. Nobody stopped digging. A young miner beside Aldric whispered prayers under his breath while working. "St. Jude preserve us. St. Jude preserve us." Another man snapped angrily. St. Jude abandoned this place years ago. No one argued with him. By midday, they finally heard movement deeper, beneath the debris. A weak knocking sound. Alive. The workers dug faster. Even Corvin himself climbed down into the pit to oversee the rescue. The scarred overseer shouted orders relentlessly, while snow drifted into the quarry above. Finally, a narrow gap opened between the fallen stones. A voice emerged from inside. Faint, terrified. "Help!" Aldric squeezed through first, because he was thinner than most of the miners. The gap scraped painfully against his shoulders, while dust choked the air around him. Inside the collapsed section, darkness pressed heavily from every direction. Torchlight barely reached beyond the opening. 3 miners remained trapped there. One had a shattered leg, twisted beneath timber beams. Another sat against the wall, bleeding heavily from the head. The third was already dead. Aldric recognized him instantly, the one-eyed worker who had shown him where to sleep the previous night. Half his chest had been crushed beneath stone. His open eye stared blankly into darkness. The injured miner beside him grabbed Aldric's sleeve desperately. "Please get us out." Aldric nodded quickly. "We will." But even as he said the words, another cracking sound echoed through the tunnel above. Stone shifted. Dust rained downward. The trapped miners began panicking immediately. "It's moving again," one cried. Outside the gap, Corvin shouted for them to hurry. Aldric and 2 others lifted the broken timber carefully from the injured man's leg. The miner screamed loud enough to echo through the entire pit. Then another deep rumble shook the tunnel. Everyone froze. A crack splintered across the ceiling overhead. Corvin's voice roared from outside. Out now! Panic exploded instantly. The workers dragged the injured miner toward the opening, while stone groaned ominously around them. Aldric turned back one final time toward the dead, one-eyed worker. For one impossible moment, he considered trying to pull the body free too. Then the ceiling shifted violently. He ran. The tunnel collapsed seconds after they escaped. Rock thundered down behind them in a deafening roar, while dust burst outward through the quarry pit. Men stumbled backward, coughing and shielding their faces. When the noise finally stopped, silence followed. Heavy, terrible silence. The dead miner remained buried forever now. Corvin spat into the snow. Back to work. Several workers stared at him in disbelief. We just nearly died, someone muttered. Corvin rounded on the man instantly. And if the Lord's stone doesn't reach the manor walls before spring, more than one of you will. No one answered, because fear fed the quarry better than food ever could. The injured miners were hauled toward the camp infirmary afterward. Infirmary meant a small hut with filthy blankets, and a woman named Agnes who knew enough herbs to dull pain slightly before death arrived. Aldric helped carry the man with the shattered leg. The miner gripped his sleeve weakly during the walk. "Thank you," he whispered. Aldric nodded silently. Inside the infirmary hut, Agnes examined the leg briefly before looking away. "It'll rot," she said quietly. The miner heard her. His face crumpled immediately. "No, no, please." Agnes only sighed tiredly. There were no miracle cures in places like this. No skilled surgeons. No proper medicine. A broken leg often meant a slow death from fever and infection. Aldric stepped outside before the man's begging could continue. Snow still fell steadily across the quarry. Gray sky, gray stone, gray faces. Everything here looked drained of life. Hugh approached him cautiously near the supply shed. "You all right?" Aldric wiped dust from his eyes. But he was. None of them were. The younger boy hesitated before speaking again. "My father used to say quarries were cursed places." Aldric looked toward the massive pits. Maybe he was right. That evening, the workers returned to their huts, exhausted beyond words. Several men limped badly after the collapse rescue. One carried a blood-soaked bandage wrapped around his hand, where 2 fingers had been crushed. Supper tasted worse than usual. Thin bean broth with floating scraps of cabbage. Yet every bowl emptied quickly. Aldric sat beside Hugh, while men around them muttered quietly. 3 collapses this winter already. Grounds unstable deeper down. Corvin doesn't care. He gets paid either way. Across the hut, an older worker named Stefan spoke suddenly. "You know what the worst part is?" Nobody answered. Stefan stared into his bowl. "After enough time here, you stop fearing death. The room grew quieter. You start fearing survival instead. No one argued with him. Later that night, Aldric noticed something strange. One miner's bed remained empty. The dead one-eyed worker's place. Nobody touched it. Nobody moved his blanket. The empty space lingered there, like a ghost everyone silently acknowledged. Aldric lay awake long after the others slept. The storm outside had weakened now. Only distant wind remained. His thoughts drifted again toward Brackenholt, toward Edith, toward Elswythe's fever. Days had passed already, maybe longer. Time blurred inside the quarry. He wondered whether his daughter still lived. The thought hollowed him from the inside. Eventually, Hugh's quiet voice emerged from nearby darkness. "Do you think peasants go to heaven?" Aldric blinked. "What?" Hugh stared upward toward the leaking roof. "The priests always speak about kings and saints. Knights, martyrs," he swallowed slowly. "Never people like us." Aldric did not know how to answer. After a long silence, he finally said, "Maybe heaven's the only place poor folk ever get treated fairly." Hugh gave a weak laugh. Then the hut fell quiet again. Near dawn, Aldric drifted into restless sleep. This time, he dreamed of the manor feast. Bright halls filled with candles, tables overflowing with roasted meat and sweet wine, nobles laughing beneath banners. But when Aldric looked closer, every servant carrying food wore the face of someone dead. Tobin, Bertram, the one-eyed miner, all silently working, while snow fell inside the hall. Then at the center table sat Lord Edric, smiling calmly as Elswythe coughed blood into her hands beside him. Aldric woke sharply. Voices echoed outside. Angry voices. He sat upright immediately. Men were gathering near the quarry entrance. Shouting, Aldric stepped into the freezing dawn. Workers crowded around 2 guards near the supply carts. Something had happened. Then he saw it. A body hanging from the wooden crane above the quarry pit. Thin, barefoot, frozen stiff in the morning wind. Hugh stopped beside Aldric, horror spreading across his face. "Who is that?" An older worker answered quietly. "Thomas." Aldric remembered him vaguely. A miner with missing teeth who rarely spoke. "What happened?" "Tried to run last night." Silence spread through the gathered workers. The corpse swung gently above the quarry. A wooden sign hung around the dead man's neck. "Thieves and RUNAWYS, feed the crows." Corvin emerged moments later. "Look carefully," he announced. "That's the road home for anyone thinking about escape." Snowflakes drifted slowly around the hanging body. No one spoke, but for the first time since arriving at the quarry, Aldric noticed something new in the workers' faces. Not just fear anymore. Hatred. The morning after the hanging, the quarry did not feel like the same place. Not because anything had changed in the stone or the wind, but because something had shifted inside the men who worked there. Silence still existed, but it was different now. Heavier, intentional, Aldric noticed it immediately as he moved with the others toward the pit. No one joked. No one argued. Even coughing seemed quieter, as if the workers feared drawing attention from the frozen corpse still swinging above them. Thomas's body had not been removed. It hung there like a warning that refused to fade. Snow clung to his hair and shoulders. His feet turned slowly with the wind. The wooden sign around his neck tapped softly against his chest each time he rotated. Thieves and RUNAWAYS, feed the crows. Hugh walked beside Aldric without speaking. For the first time, the boy did not look down at the ground. He looked up at the body. Something in his face had hardened overnight. At the pit, Corvin stood waiting as usual, wrapped in his heavy wolf fur coat. Guards lined the edges of the quarry like statues carved from iron and boredom. No greetings were given. No explanation followed. Only work. Deeper section today, Corvin called out. Stone for the eastern wall. A worker near Aldric muttered, barely audible. There won't be an eastern wall if this keeps going. A guard stepped forward instantly and struck him with the butt of a spear. The man collapsed without a sound, then got up again, because that was what life in the quarry taught. Fall, stand, work, repeat until it stopped mattering. They descended once more into the pit. The deeper section was worse. The rock here was older, denser, and colder than anything above. Every strike of a pickaxe echoed like it was hitting bone instead of stone. Dust filled the air so thickly that breathing felt like swallowing sand. Aldric worked beside Hugh near a fractured wall. The boy's movements were slower than usual, measured, controlled. After some time, Hugh spoke quietly without looking up. Do you think he felt anything? Aldric paused. Thomas. Hugh nodded. Aldric hesitated. No one feels anything at the end, he said finally. That's the only mercy left. Hugh didn't respond right away. Then he said, I don't think I want mercy like that. The words unsettled Aldric more than he expected. Hours passed. Then something happened that no one noticed at first. The guards changed their routine. Usually, they stood at the edges of the pit, watching, counting, waiting. But today, 2 of them disappeared for a while into the upper walkway near Corvin's hut. The workers noticed the absence slowly. At first, just a glance. Then another. Aldric felt it too. Something was off. Corvin remained near the top of the quarry, speaking with a messenger who had arrived on horseback. Their conversation was too distant to hear clearly, but the tone was sharp, urgent. By midday, the wind shifted, and with it came distant sound. Not hammering, not shouting, something else. A bell, but not the quarry bell. Aldric stopped mid-strike. He listened carefully. Hugh looked up too. That's church bells, the boy whispered. Aldric's grip tightened on his pickaxe. Church bells in Brackenholt, meant only one thing: death, or something close to it. The sound came again, faint, carried by wind from the south, then stopped. Work continued, but slower now, distracted, uneasy. Even Corvin noticed. Eyes forward, he shouted down into the pit. Stone doesn't cut itself, but no one truly returned to focus. Because once you hear bells from home in a place like this, your body stops belonging to the quarry for a moment. It goes somewhere else, to huts, to fires, to names you have not spoken in days. Aldric felt it sharply. Edith, Elswythe, Martin, the goat, the village, the fever, the silence after Bertram. Everything he had been forced to bury under labor rose again, like something trying to breathe through soil. Then the second bell came, closer, stronger, not from memory, from reality. Hugh dropped his tool. Aldric turned sharply. The guards at the edge of the pit were now running. Not walking, running. Corvin's voice echoed from above, but it was different now, less controlled. Secure the gate. Another shout followed. South Road, block it. The workers stopped entirely. Aldric climbed partway up a rock ledge, instinctively, straining to see beyond the quarry walls. Smoke, far away on the horizon. Not quarry smoke, village smoke. Thick, dark, wrong. A chill spread through his chest. Something was happening in Brackenholt. Something bad enough that even here, in this forgotten pit of suffering, it mattered. A guard grabbed Aldric's shoulder. Back to work. Aldric did not move. The guard struck him with a fist. He staggered, but stayed upright. Hugh suddenly spoke, loudly enough for others to hear. It's the village. That single sentence broke the remaining discipline. Men began looking up. Whispers spread instantly. Brackenholt, fire, plague. Corvin appeared at the edge of the pit, face tight with anger. DOWN, he roared, or you join Thomas. But the warning no longer carried the same weight, because Thomas was already dead, and something worse than death had just reached them from home. Aldric climbed higher, against orders, against pain. He reached a ledge near the upper rock face, where he could see beyond the quarry walls. And then he saw it clearly. Brackenholt was burning. Not completely, but parts of it were gone. Smoke rose in thick columns from the village center. Fires moved through clusters of huts. Even from miles away, he could see movement. Too much movement. Panic, not order, not normal disaster. Something had broken. Aldric's breath caught painfully in his chest. Hugh reached his side moments later, climbing with desperate urgency. When the boy saw it, he froze. Oh God. Aldric didn't answer, because there was no answer that mattered. Below them, Corvin was shouting orders to seal the quarry entirely. Guards rushed toward gates and supply carts, but none of that reached Aldric anymore. All he could see was home burning in the distance. and inside that burning world, his children, somewhere behind him, a miner whispered the truth no one wanted to say aloud. If the village burns, there's no one to pay us. Another voice followed quietly. If there's no village, there's no quarry. For the first time, even Corvin stopped shouting, because everyone, suddenly, understood the same terrifying idea. The system that fed them all lords, reeves, taxes, quarry, labor, depended on a village that might no longer exist. Aldric stepped back from the ledge slowly. His hands were shaking. Hugh looked at him. What do we do? Aldric didn't answer immediately, because for the first time since his life began, survival no longer had a clear direction. The village was burning, the quarry was unstable, and the world he knew was starting to collapse in more ways than stone ever could. For a long moment after seeing the smoke, Aldric could not move properly. His body still remembered the quarry, the ropes, the stone, the guards shouting. But his mind had already left it behind, climbing southward over frozen hills toward Brackenholt, where everything that mattered to him was turning into ash. Hugh stood beside him on the ledge, breathing fast. Below, chaos was spreading through the quarry. Men argued openly now. Some dropped their tools entirely. Others began walking toward the exits without permission, only to be struck back by guards trying to restore control that was already slipping. Corvin's voice cut through it all, sharp and furious. No one leaves. Seal the gates. But it was too late for command, because fear had changed shape. It was no longer fear of punishment. It was fear of absence, of homes disappearing, of debts becoming meaningless, because the world that enforced them might no longer exist. Aldric slowly climbed down from the ledge. His hands felt numb. Hugh followed closely. Your family, Hugh said quietly. Aldric swallowed. I know. That was all he could manage. Around them, miners gathered in tight clusters, speaking in low, urgent tones. If the village burns, who feeds the manor? If the manor loses control, who pays us? We'll be left here until winter kills us. The old structure of their world was cracking in real time, not with a single collapse, but with uncertainty spreading like frost through weak wood. A guard grabbed Aldric again, near the pit entrance. Back in line. Aldric didn't resist this time, not because he obeyed, but because something else had become more important than obedience or punishment. He needed to reach Brackenholt. Alive or not, Corvin appeared near the central gate, speaking quickly with his messenger again. This time his voice was lower, controlled, but tense beneath the surface. No reports from the South Road, he muttered. Aldric heard only fragments. Village unrest, grain stores, possible revolt. The word revolt hit the air like a dropped blade. Several guards shifted uneasily, because revolt meant something different than theft or sickness. Revolt meant loss of control. Loss of control meant collapse, of everything built on obedience. Aldric stepped forward without thinking. "Let me go," he said. Corvin turned slowly. For the first time since Aldric had arrived, the overseer looked uncertain. "You're chained to my quarry," Corvin replied. "Not anymore," Aldric said quietly. "If the village is burning, there's nothing left here to hold me." A murmur passed through nearby miners. Hugh stepped beside him. "I'm going too." That changed the air again. Not because Hugh was important, but because he was young enough that leaving felt possible. Corvin stared at them both, then at the horizon, then at his guards. Something was breaking in his calculation. If Brackenholt truly fell, he would lose workers. If workers left now, he would lose control of the quarry. If the quarry stopped, his authority under Lord Edric would weaken. Everything depended on everything else. A fragile chain, and one link was already burning. Corvin exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said at last. Aldric blinked. For a moment, he didn't believe it. Corvin pointed toward the south path. "Go. If there's anything left of your village, you'll find it faster than I can stop you." A guard protested immediately. "Sir, let them go," Corvin snapped. Then quieter, almost to himself. "If the south is collapsing, I need to know what survives it." Aldric didn't wait for anything else. He ran. Hugh followed instantly. Behind them, no chains stopped them. No gates closed. No bells rang them back. Only wind and distant smoke guided their path. The journey south felt unreal from the beginning. The quarry disappeared behind them within minutes, swallowed by hills and snow. But the sky ahead stayed wrong. Aldric ran until his lungs burned. Hugh struggled to keep pace, but did not stop. Hours passed. No one spoke, only breath and footsteps on frozen ground. At one point, they crossed a shallow stream half frozen over. Aldric slipped once, nearly falling in, but caught himself in time. When Hugh reached him, he noticed something in Aldric's expression. "Do you think they're gone?" the boy asked. Aldric shook his head immediately. "No," but the word sounded less like certainty and more like refusal. By late afternoon, the smell reached them. Smoke first, then something worse beneath it. Burnt wood, charred straw, ash carried by wind. Aldric slowed. Hugh did too. They climbed a small ridge, and Brackenholt came into view, or what remained of it. The village was not fully destroyed, but it was wounded. Several huts were burned down entirely, leaving blackened skeletons of wood. The well area was crowded with movement. Too many people in one place, shouting, pushing, dragging things. Aldric's heart tightened violently. Then he saw the manor guards. Not all of them, just a few, retreating. That detail mattered more than the fire itself, because manor guards did not retreat unless something had forced them to. Hugh grabbed Aldric's arm. There, Aldric followed his gaze. Near the center lane, by the broken stalks, a group of villagers stood together, not scattered, together. Some held tools, some held nothing, but they were not fleeing. They were standing, and facing them was Oswin, the reeve. Aldric felt something shift inside him immediately. Oswin was alive, which meant Edith and the children might still be. A sound cut through the air suddenly. Not a bell, a shout, then another. The crowd surged slightly forward. Aldric started running before thinking. Hugh followed again. As they approached, the details sharpened. The stocks were broken open. The well area was scorched, but not fully destroyed. And in the middle of it all lay a collapsed structure that had once been the grain storehouse, now half burned. Aldric pushed through villagers desperately. People turned and saw him, but reacted too slowly to stop him. He shouted, "Edith!" No answer. "Edith!" His voice cracked slightly on the second call. Then he saw movement near the edge of the crowd. A woman standing, holding something small. A child, alive. Aldric stumbled forward. Edith turned. For a moment, she didn't move, like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then Elswythe coughed weakly in her arms, and everything broke at once. Edith ran toward him. Aldric met her halfway and pulled them both into him so tightly it almost hurt. Martin appeared moments later from behind another villager, shouting his name and crashing into his side. For several seconds, there was only breath, no words, just holding on. Then Aldric pulled back slightly. His hands shook as he looked at Elswythe. Her face was pale, but she was breathing. "Fever?" he asked immediately. Edith nodded, but she survived it, barely. Aldric closed his eyes for a second. Relief hit him so sharply, it almost felt like pain. Then reality returned around them. Burned village, shouting men, Oswin standing nearby with a bruised face and torn clothing. And behind it all, something had changed permanently. The villagers were no longer just peasants waiting for orders. They had fought back. Aldric looked at Oswin. The reeve noticed him immediately, and for the first time in his life, Aldric saw something unfamiliar in Oswin's expression. Not authority, not certainty, uncertainty. The world had shifted again, and this time it would not return to what it was before. The air in Brackenholt no longer felt like it belonged to the same world Aldric had left behind. Smoke still drifted in thin layers above the burned huts, but it no longer carried the smell of simple destruction. It carried something worse, unfinished conflict, anger that had not yet cooled, and a kind of fragile tension that made every sound feel sharper than it should be. Aldric stood with Edith, Martin, and Elswythe pressed close to him, as if letting go might make them disappear again. But his eyes were fixed on the village center, on Oswin. The reeve was still alive, still standing, but not untouched. His cloak was torn at the shoulder. Dirt and ash streaked his face. One side of his mouth was swollen, as if he had taken a hard blow during whatever had happened before Aldric arrived. That alone told a story the villagers did not speak aloud. Brackenholt had fought, and for once, the fight had not been entirely one-sided. Hugh arrived behind Aldric moments later, breathing heavily from the run. He froze when he saw the village in its damaged state, eyes widening as he took in the broken stocks, scattered belongings, and clusters of exhausted villagers gathered like survivors after a storm. "This is your home," Hugh whispered. Aldric didn't answer immediately, because even he wasn't sure what to call it anymore. Home suggested safety. This place had never truly offered that. Now it barely offered structure. Oswin's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "We held the line," he said loudly, though his tone lacked the usual sharp command. The manor riders were pushed back. The grain stores, what remains, are under control. A few villagers muttered in response, not fully convinced. A woman near the well shouted suddenly, "Control, half the village is ash." Oswin turned toward her slowly. Without order, there would be nothing left to argue about. The reply should have silenced her. It didn't. Instead, another voice rose. "And what about the tax collectors? They fled before the fire even finished." That statement changed the air again, because it confirmed something important. This wasn't just disaster. It was collapse of authority. Aldric shifted slightly, still holding Elswithe. Edith's grip on his sleeve tightened. "People died," she whispered. Aldric nodded once. "I know." He could see it in the way villagers avoided certain spots in the lane. Covered shapes near the edge of the square. Hastily moved bodies. The absence of names being spoken aloud. Death had always existed in Brackenholt, but now it had become visible in a different way. Not quiet, not accepted, recent. Oswin raised his voice again, trying to regain control. "The manor will respond. Lord Edric will not ignore this. We must prepare for retaliation." A sudden shout interrupted him. From the edge of the crowd, a man stepped forward, holding a broken farming tool like a weapon. "No more orders," the man said. The words were simple, but they landed heavily. Oswin stared at him. "You think chaos saves you?" the reeve snapped. The man shook his head. "No, I think obedience killed us slowly. Fire just made it visible." A silence followed. Not peaceful, charged. Aldric felt something tighten inside his chest as he watched the exchange. This was not the same village that had stood quietly in mud and snow days ago, while Tobin froze in the stocks. Something had shifted fundamentally. Fear was still there, but it was no longer absolute. Oswin stepped forward slightly. "You don't understand what comes next." The man laughed bitterly. "We already lived what comes next." That sentence changed something in the crowd. Not everyone agreed, but enough people understood it, because what comes next had always been used as a threat. Hunger, Punishment, debt, winter. Now those things had already arrived. There was nothing left behind the warning. Aldric looked down at Martin briefly, then at Elswythe, then at Edith. They were alive. That alone should have been enough. But survival alone was no longer the full question. Not after everything. Hugh stepped closer to Aldric again. What do they want now? The boy asked quietly. Aldric didn't answer immediately, because the truth was still forming in real time. Around them, villagers began moving in small groups, not fleeing, not obeying, organizing in uncertain, improvised ways. Some gathered food from damaged stores. Others helped pull debris from collapsed huts. But none of it followed Oswin's direction. The Reeve noticed it too. For the first time, his voice softened slightly. This is still Lord Edric's land. A woman nearby replied immediately. Then where is he? That question hung there longer than expected, because no one had seen the Lord's response. No riders returned. No message arrived. Only silence from the manor beyond the hills. Oswin hesitated, and that hesitation was new. Aldric stepped forward slightly, without fully realizing it. Oswin saw him immediately. Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. Not respect, not forgiveness, recognition of chain. You, Oswin said finally, voice lower now. You were taken. Aldric nodded. I was, and yet here you stand. Aldric glanced briefly at Edith and the children. Not everything stayed where it was supposed to. Oswin studied him for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted toward the villagers again. We cannot survive another collapse, the Reeve said, quieter now. The manor will return. If not with soldiers, then with worse. Debt collectors, hunger enforcement, replacement authority. A few villagers listened. Others did not. A man near the fire-scarred grain store shouted back. We survived you already. That sentence carried more weight than it should have, because it was partially true. Brackenholt had survived Oswin's control. Not cleanly, not safely, but it had broken the expectation of total obedience. Aldric felt Elswythe shift slightly in his arms. She was awake now, watching, her small hand curled around his sleeve. That simple touch anchored him more than anything else in the chaos around them. Edith leaned closer. What do we do? She whispered. Aldric didn't answer right away, because for years, that question always had the same answer. Work, obey, endure. But that system had already cracked. Now the answer was no longer given. It had to be chosen. Hugh spoke quietly beside him. If the manor comes back, they'll punish everyone. Aldric nodded slightly. Yes, and if they don't come back, Hugh added. Aldric looked toward the smoke, still drifting above the village, then toward the road leading to the manor hill, then toward the burned grain store, finally toward the people gathering in uncertain clusters, waiting for direction that no longer arrived cleanly. "I don't think they disappear," Aldric said at last. Edith looked at him sharply. "What does that mean?" Aldric tightened his hold on Elswith slightly. "It means this isn't over." A distant horn sounded suddenly from somewhere beyond the hills. Low, long, not from Brackenholt, not from memory, from approach. Several villagers turned immediately toward the sound. Oswin stiffened. "That's manor signal," he muttered. The crowd shifted again. Uncertainty returned instantly, pressing down on whatever fragile confidence had begun forming. Aldric looked toward the horizon, where the road from the manor curved through the hills. Dark shapes were moving there, slow, deliberate, rising out of distance like a consequence, finally arriving in person. Hugh swallowed hard. "They're coming," he said quietly. Aldric didn't move. Edith held the children tighter, and Brackenholt burned, shaken, uncertain, waited for what the next version of its misery would look like. The horn echoed again across the hills, this time closer, heavier. It rolled through the burned remains of Brackenholt, like something being dragged across stone. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the wind seemed to slow. Then movement returned to the village in bursts, sharp, uneven, panicked organization. People who had been arguing moments ago now looked in the same direction. Toward the road, toward the ridge line where the manor path descended into view. Aldric did not move at first. He only watched, because he had seen enough comings in his life to know they rarely arrived with mercy attached. Edith shifted beside him. "Are they soldiers?" she asked quietly. Aldric narrowed his eyes. "Not just soldiers." The shapes on the ridge became clearer. A line of riders. Behind them carts. And behind those, more figures on foot. Not a raid. Not a patrol. Something larger. Oswin stepped forward, squinting into the distance. His earlier authority had not returned, but habit still kept him speaking. "Manor response force," he said. "They've brought enforcement." A woman nearby spat into the ash. "Enforcement for what? Were the ones buried in it?" Oswin did not answer, because the riders were close enough now that excuses no longer mattered. The lead horse reached the edge of the village road and stopped. The rider dismounted slowly, a man in layered dark wool, trimmed with fine leather that had not seen mud. His boots were clean in a way that felt almost insulting after everything Brackenholt had endured. He looked around once, just once, then spoke. "I am Steward Halric of Lord Edric's household." Silence followed. Not respectful silence. Careful silence. Halric continued. "This settlement has failed its obligations. Grain stores damaged. Tax disruption. Property destruction. Assault on manor representatives." A murmur rose instantly through the crowd. Aldric felt Edith tense beside him. Hugh whispered under his breath, "They're counting it like a ledger." Halric raised a hand slightly. I am not here for debate. That sentence settled heavily because it confirmed what kind of man stood before them. Not a negotiator, an accountant of consequences. Behind him, more riders dismounted. Guards spread out slowly, forming a loose perimeter around the village center. Not attacking, not yet. Measuring, Halric's eyes moved across the crowd again, then stopped. On Oswin, you were instructed to maintain order. Oswin straightened instinctively. I did what I could. The fire. Halric cut him off. I didn't ask for explanation. The simplicity of that rejection made Oswin fall silent. For the first time, Aldric saw the reeve without a role to stand inside. Halric turned back to the villagers. This situation will be corrected. A man from the crowd shouted immediately. Corrected how? We've nothing left. Halric looked toward him without emotion. Then you will work until there is something. That answer landed like stone. Aldric felt something inside his chest tighten again. Not fear this time, but recognition. Nothing had changed in the structure, only the face delivering it. Halric continued. A temporary labor directive will be established. Supplies will be requisitioned from surrounding holdings. Order will be restored. A bitter laugh broke from somewhere in the crowd. Order, someone repeated. That's what you call this. Halric's gaze shifted slightly. Call it what you wish. It will still exist. That was the difference. Not morality, not justice, just persistence. Edith leaned closer to Aldric. If they take everything again, she whispered. Aldric didn't answer immediately, because he understood something uncomfortable now. Brackenholt had not escaped its world. It had only damaged its surface. And now the world was returning to repair the damage, not for the village, but for itself. Halric raised his hand slightly again. Those responsible for the disruption will be identified. That sentence changed the air immediately. Identified, not found out, not understood. Identified, as if guilt was already pre-sorted. Aldric felt multiple villagers shift uneasily. Eyes began moving, not toward the manor forces, toward each other. That was how punishment survived disasters. It learned to travel through people. Oswin spoke suddenly. It was not one person, he said quickly. The unrest. Halric looked at him again. Step aside. Oswin stopped speaking immediately. And for the first time since Aldric had known him, the reeve obeyed without resistance. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Halric turned slightly. His gaze swept again across the crowd. It paused briefly on Aldric, longer than before. Aldric did not look away. Something passed between them in that moment. Not recognition of identity, recognition of category. Worker, asset, problem that had walked out of its expected place. Halric continued speaking. All households will be assessed. Livestock, grain, and able-bodied workers will be recorded. A woman screamed suddenly from the back. Half of us are sick already. Halric did not react. That will be noted. Noted, like everything else. Hugh whispered again. They're turning us into numbers. Aldric's grip tightened slightly on Elswythe. She was watching the riders now. Quiet, tired, alive, but listening. Halric gestured toward the burned grain store. Reconstruction begins immediately. A man from the village stepped forward. His voice was rough. With what food? You took it all already. Halric finally paused for a fraction, longer than before, then replied, Then you will rebuild first. Provision comes after productivity. Aldric exhaled slowly. That was it. The loop continued. Fire did not end obligation. It only changed the method of extracting it. A sound suddenly came from the edge of the road. Another group approaching. Smaller. No riders. Just two figures. One carried a wooden staff. The other walked slightly behind, limping. As they came closer, Aldric recognized them. One of the older villagers, and a younger man he did not know well. They stopped near the center of the crowd. The older one spoke loudly. We will not return to how it was. A shift rippled through the villagers. Halric watched them, unmoved. The man continued. You speak of order. We lived order. It burned our homes. A few villagers nodded. Others looked away. Halric replied calmly, You are alive because order continues. The older man shook his head. We are alive because you were not here when we fought. That sentence changed the tone instantly because it suggested something dangerous. That control had already slipped once and could again. Halric studied him for a moment, then said quietly, Resistance will be recorded. The man laughed bitterly. That's all you do, isn't it? Record us until we disappear. Aldric felt the village split internally at that moment. Not physically, but in direction. Some villagers still looked toward Halric. Hopping structure would return. Others looked at the two men, sensing a different possibility forming. Edith held his arm tightly. What happens now? She whispered again. Aldric finally answered. I think they decide what Brackenholt becomes, without asking if Brackenholt agrees. Hugh looked up at him. And if we don't accept it? Aldric stared at the riders, then at the burned homes, then at his family. We already know what refusing costs, he said quietly. Above them, the horn sounded again from the ridge. Long, final, and this time, the procession behind Halric began to move forward into the village. Slowly, like inevitability, taking shape on foot, the procession entered Brackenholt like a slow judgment that refused to rush. Boots pressed into ash, hooves disturbed burned straw and broken timber. The villagers did not scatter this time. They also did not welcome. Instead, they shifted aside in tense clusters, like water forced around a stone that had suddenly appeared in its path. Halric remained at the front, unhurried, unshaken. Behind him, the manor guards spread through the village in practiced patterns, marking boundaries without speaking. One group moved toward the remains of the grain store, another toward the well, a third toward the livestock pens. Inventory before conversation. That was the order of things. Aldric felt Edith's fingers tight around his arm. Elswythe rested weakly against her shoulder, still recovering from fever, her breathing uneven but steady. Martin stayed close to Aldric's side, watching everything with wide, uncertain eyes. Hugh stood slightly behind them now, quieter than before. The boy had seen too much in too little time. Oswin followed at a distance, no longer directing anything. His authority had not vanished, but it had been absorbed into something larger and colder. The manor system had arrived to reclaim control from its own damaged edge. Halric stopped at the center of the village square. What used to be the busiest place in Brackenholt now looked like a blackened ground, half-collapsed stalls, and scattered remnants of daily life that no longer had a rhythm to belong to. He raised a hand. The guards stopped immediately. Silence again. Halric spoke without raising his voice. List begins now. A clerk stepped forward carrying parchment and ink, even in the wind. A small, absurd detail, careful writing amid ruin. Names began to be called. Households first, then livestock counts, then able-bodied workers. Each name pulled someone forward into visibility, as if existence itself had to be confirmed under new conditions. A woman nearby whispered, "They're counting us like grain sacks." Aldric watched carefully, because he understood something dangerous about counting. Once something is counted, it becomes movable, replaceable, ownable. Halric's gaze moved steadily as names were recorded. No urgency, no emotion, only structure. Then he spoke again. Those whose homes were destroyed will be reassigned sheltering quarters under manor oversight. A murmur rose immediately. A man shouted from the side, "That means the old barns." Halric nodded slightly. "Yes." Another voice followed, "And we work for it." Halric looked toward him. "You always worked for it." That answer landed with quiet force, because it was not new. It was simply stated without disguise. Aldric felt Martin shift beside him. The boy whispered, "Father." Aldric didn't respond immediately, because something was forming in his mind that he didn't fully want to see yet. Not rebellion, not obedience, something in between. Halric continued, "Reconstruction labor will begin at dawn. Priority will be given to grain storage, fencing, and road repair." A villager near the front stepped forward. "What about food?" Halric answered without hesitation. "Rations will be distributed according to output." That sentence tightened the crowd again. Output, not need, not survival. Output, a system that measured hunger in exchange for labor. Edith leaned closer to Aldric. "If we can't work, we don't eat," she whispered. Aldric nodded slightly. "That's always been true," he said. But now it was more visible. Halric gestured slightly, and 2 guards moved forward, dragging a small cart. Inside were sacks. Grain. Not much, but enough to matter. A collective silence followed the sight, because scarcity always controlled more effectively than threats. Halric spoke again. "Initial distribution begins immediately for registered households." A few villagers instinctively moved forward, then stopped because they noticed the condition. Registration required acknowledgement. Acknowledgement meant submission to the list. The clerk's parchment was not just record. It was structure being rewritten. Aldric watched as Oswin slowly stepped closer to Halric. The reeve spoke quietly. "The village is unstable. Some individuals may resist allocation." Halric didn't look at him. "They will be managed." Oswin hesitated. "Forces," Halric replied simply. "Consequences." That word again. Aldric had heard it before, in different forms. Reeve punishment, quarry discipline, manor law. But now it was being used without explanation, as if consequence itself was sufficient justification. A sudden shout came from the edge of the square. The older villager, who had spoken earlier, stepped forward again. "We buried our dead without your permission," he said loudly. The crowd shifted slightly. Halric turned toward him. "Continue." The man frowned. "You don't care." Halric answered calmly. "The dead do not affect output." A silence followed, so deep it felt unnatural. Even the guards seemed momentarily still, because it was not cruelty in tone. It was absence of relevance. That difference unsettled people more than anger would have. The man continued anyway. "We won't accept being reduced to labor lists." Halric finally looked directly at him. "For generations," he said, "you have already been labor lists. You simply lacked the language to see it." That sentence rippled through the village. Some people reacted with anger, others with confusion, a few with something worse, recognition. Aldric felt it too, in a way he didn't want to admit, because his life had already been measured. Days in fields, days in quarry, days in debt, days in fear. Halric raised a hand, slightly again. Distribution proceeds. The grain sacks were opened. A controlled line formed reluctantly, not fully obedient, not fully resistant, something uncertain in between. Aldric watched carefully. Edith's grip on him loosened slightly. "We should go," she whispered. Aldric nodded, but he didn't move yet, because something in Halric's presence bothered him deeply. Not brutality, not authority, but the assumption that everything could be restored through structure alone, even after fire, even after revolt, even after death. Hugh stepped closer. "What are you thinking?" the boy asked quietly. Aldric didn't answer immediately. Then he said, I'm thinking they don't see us as broken. Hugh frowned. What do they see us as? Aldric looked at the line forming for grain. Repairable. That word carried its own kind of danger, because repair implies ownership. Halric suddenly raised his voice again. One final matter. The village stilled. This settlement will be placed under temporary direct oversight until productivity stabilizes. A murmur spread. Temporary, but nothing about it sounded temporary. Aldric felt Edith tense again. Halric continued. A reeve will be appointed under manor supervision. Oswin stiffened slightly. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face, because even he was not immune to replacement. Halric looked at him briefly. Your conduct will be reviewed. Oswin said nothing. That silence was new for him. Halric's gaze moved across the villagers again, then paused just briefly on Aldric, long enough to be noticed, not as punishment, not as recognition, but as assessment. Then Halric turned away, and the system resumed moving. Aldric finally stepped back with Edith and the children, but as they moved toward what remained of their shelter, Hugh followed quietly. You think it will get better? The boy asked. Aldric looked at the burned remains of Brackenholt one more time, then at the lines forming, then at the guards, then at the horizon, where the manor road disappeared into hills. I think, he said slowly, it will become stable again. Hugh frowned. That's not better. Aldric didn't deny it, because he was beginning to understand something that made survival feel heavier than before. Stability was not the opposite of misery. It was often just misery that lasted longer without interruption. Behind them, Halric's voice continued directing lists and distribution. Behind him, Oswin stood silent for the first time in memory, and ahead of them, Brackenholt slowly began to rebuild, not as it was before, but as something that could endure the same suffering again, more efficiently than ever. The days that followed did not feel like recovery. They felt like reassembly. Brackenholt was rebuilt piece by piece, but nothing returned in the shape it had before the fire. The burned huts were cleared first. Charred beams dragged away in carts. Ash shoveled into piles at the edge of the fields. The grain store was rebuilt in a smaller, thicker form, less hopeful, more defensive, as if the village itself now expected to be struck again. Aldric worked every day, not in the quarry anymore, not under chains, but under something subtler. The list, Halric's system, had settled into the village like frost that did not melt. Every household had been recorded, every worker assigned, every sack of grain accounted for twice, once by the clerk, once by the guards watching the clerk. Nothing was allowed to drift. Nothing was allowed to remain unseen. Aldric noticed it most in small things. The way people no longer gathered freely in groups. The way conversations ended when guards passed. The way even grief had become scheduled around labor hours. Edith worked near the rebuilt storage huts, sorting grain under supervision. Martin carried small bundles of straw. Elswith stayed close to her mother, still weak, but improving slowly as food distribution stabilized. Survival had returned, but it came with boundaries. Hugh remained in Brackenholt too. He had chosen to stay when the quarry men were reassigned or dismissed. There was no longer a quarry command structure nearby, only scattered labor sent between villages. One afternoon, Hugh found Aldric near the edge of a repaired fence line. "They're measuring everything," the boy said quietly. Aldric didn't look up from the post he was securing. "They always have." Hugh shook his head. "No, before it felt like punishment. Now it feels like design." That made Aldric pause. He finally looked at him. "Design doesn't care if you understand it," Aldric said. Hugh frowned. "That's worse." Aldric didn't argue. Because it was. Across the village, Halric's clerks continued updating records daily. New lists, revised lists, adjustments based on illness, recovery, or loss. Even death no longer disrupted the system. It was simply marked, removed, recalculated. Oswin had been kept in place, but his authority had changed shape. He no longer issued orders directly. Instead, he relayed instructions already determined elsewhere, and in doing so, he became something more dangerous than before, a man enforcing rules he did not create. One evening, as Aldric returned from field repair, he noticed a gathering near the well. Not disorderly, not rebellious, carefully contained. Halric stood at its center again, speaking to a group of villagers. Aldric stopped at a distance. Hugh stood beside him. "He never leaves," Hugh muttered. Aldric nodded slightly. "He doesn't need to." Halric's voice carried clearly across the square. "Productivity has improved," he said. "But instability indicators remain." A villager called out, "We're not machines." Halric turned toward him. "No," he replied. "Machines are simpler. You require maintenance." A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the crowd, but they died quickly because no one knew whether it was meant as insult or classification. Halric continued, "Winter rationing will be adjusted. Households with reduced output will receive reduced allocation." A woman stepped forward. "That means children suffer for illness." Halric nodded. "Yes." No hesitation. No softness. Just confirmation. Aldric felt Edith's earlier fear return in his mind. If you cannot work, you do not eat. It had always been true, but now it was written down, formalized, permanent. Hugh leaned closer to Aldric. "They've removed chance," he whispered. Aldric replied quietly, "No." Hugh looked at him. "They've just made it consistent." That word again. Consistency, stability, structure, words that sounded safe when spoken from far away, but when lived inside them, they became something else entirely. That night, Aldric sat outside their repaired hut. The fire inside was small but steady. Edith was inside, mending clothes. The children slept. The village was quiet, in a way it had never been before. Not peaceful, controlled. Hugh approached and sat beside him on a broken stone. For a while neither spoke. Then Hugh asked, "Do you think it ends?" Aldric exhaled slowly. "What ends?" "All of it." Aldric looked toward the rebuilt grain store in the distance, toward the faint glow of guarded lanterns, toward the shapes of clerks still working late into the night. "I don't think it ends," he said. "I think it spreads." Hugh frowned. "Spreads where?" Aldric didn't answer immediately, because the answer felt too large to say plainly. Then he said quietly, "Anywhere there are people who need feeding." Silence followed, not uncomfortable, just heavy. Hugh picked at the ground with a stick. "Then what do we do?" Aldric almost laughed at the question, not because it was foolish, because it was too honest. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he said, "We survive it differently than before." Hugh looked up. "How?" Aldric stared at his hands. The same hands that had worked fields, pulled carts, carried stone, broken rope, held his family. "I don't know yet," he admitted. That honesty hung in the air longer than anything else he had said. Behind them, Brackenholt settled into its new rhythm. Not healed, not free, but functioning again, and far away beyond the hills, unseen by any of them. The same system that had reached the quarry and the village before it continued extending outward, quietly, steadily, until every small place like Brackenholt would one day learn the same lesson. Survival was no longer the goal. Maintenance was. Winter deepened again, but this time it did not arrive like a shock. It arrived like procedure. Brackenholt adjusted to it in advance. Storage was rationed earlier than usual. Firewood was counted before it was burned. Even livestock movement was recorded, as if the cold itself might be audited later. Aldric noticed how quickly people learned to anticipate restriction rather than react to it. That, more than anything, showed how deeply Halric's system had settled into the village. One morning, Aldric was sent with other laborers to reinforce the outer road leading toward the manor hill. The path had become important again, not for travel, for oversight. A cart arrived midday carrying sealed crates from the manor, grain, tools, and official supplies. Guards supervised every unloading step, while a clerk marked each item against a ledger without looking up. Hugh worked beside Aldric stacking timber. The boy had grown quieter over the weeks. Not broken, just observant. "You ever think about the quarry?" Hugh asked suddenly. Aldric tightened a rope around a beam. "Sometimes. Feels far away," Hugh said. Aldric nodded. "It is." Hugh hesitated. "Do you think it was worse there or here?" Aldric paused. The question was simple, But it was. He looked at the road they were repairing, at the guards watching without emotion, at the clerk writing without pause, at Brackenholt rebuilding itself into something that would never again need to collapse to be controlled. I think, Aldric said slowly. It was louder there. Hugh frowned. That's it. Aldric looked at him. Here, it doesn't need to be loud. That answer lingered between them. By late afternoon, Halric arrived. His presence was always quiet until it was. People noticed him only after he had already begun observing them. He walked through the worksite without interruption, followed by 2 guards and a clerk carrying updated records. Oswin was there too, standing slightly behind now, like a man waiting for instructions that used to belong to him. Halric stopped near Aldric and Hugh. He looked at the partially completed road reinforcement. Progress acceptable, he said. No praise followed, just classification. The clerk marked something on parchment. Hugh kept his eyes down. Aldric continued working, but felt Halric's attention remain nearby. After a moment, the overseer spoke again. You were in the quarry, he said to Aldric. It was not a question. Aldric nodded. Yes. Halric studied him briefly. You returned. Aldric replied, yes. A pause. Then Halric asked, why? The question was unexpected. Not cruel. Not leading. Just direct. Aldric considered it carefully. Because there were many answers. Family, fear, instinct. Then finally he said, because it was still my village. Halric nodded slightly, as if nodding a useful variable. Attachment retention, he said quietly. Hugh frowned. What does that mean? Halric looked at him. It means people return to what harms them, if they believe it belongs to them. Silence followed. Aldric felt something uncomfortable in that statement, not because it was false, but because it was too clean, too neatly expressed, like something observed from a distance, rather than lived inside. Halric turned slightly toward Oswin. Stability projections. Oswin hesitated before answering. Improving. Resistance events declining. Halric nodded. Continue monitoring. Then he began walking again. But before leaving, he added one final line without turning back. Do not mistake calm for recovery. And then he was gone. The worksite resumed its rhythm, but the words remained. Do not mistake calm for recovery. That evening, Aldric returned home later than usual. The sky was heavy, with low clouds again. Snow threatened, but had not yet fallen. Inside the hut, Edith was tending a small pot of thin stew. The children sat nearby quietly. Life had become smaller, but steadier. Martin spoke first when Aldric entered. Father, the road people said the manor might send more guards. Aldric set down his tools. I heard. Elswythe looked up at him. Will they take things again? Aldric paused, then shook his head slightly. I don't think they need to take things anymore. Edith looked at him sharply. What do you mean? Aldric sat slowly near the fire. "I think they already have what they need," he said. "Now, they're just making sure it stays where it is." That statement unsettled the room more than fear would have, because fear was familiar, but permanence was harder to understand. Outside, wind moved through the rebuilt village. Not violently, not destructively, just consistently, like something that intended to stay. Later that night, Hugh visited briefly. He sat near the doorway. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. Aldric looked at him. "Understand what?" Hugh stared at the fire. "It doesn't end, because no one wants it to end." Aldric didn't respond immediately, because that was dangerously close to the truth. Hugh continued. "The manor doesn't collapse. The village doesn't escape. The quarry doesn't disappear." He swallowed. "It just keeps changing shape." Aldric nodded slowly. "Yes." Hugh looked up. "So what are we inside of?" Aldric stared into the fire for a long time, then finally said, "A thing that keeps going, because stopping would require more effort than continuing." Silence followed, not fearful, just final in its own way. Outside, Brackenholt held steady beneath winter clouds. Not healed, not destroyed, but maintained. Winter finally broke in Brackenholt without ceremony. There was no announcement of change, no sudden relief, no moment where suffering simply stepped aside. Instead, the snow softened first. Then the mud returned. Then the wind shifted direction. Life resumed its familiar shape, only now that shape had been tightened, measured, and recorded. Aldric noticed the difference most in the mornings. Work assignments were clearer, rations more precise. Even arguments between villagers had become shorter, as if people had learned that excess emotion only delayed survival. The system did not loosen. It refined. One morning, Aldric was called to the central square, along with several other laborers. Hugh was already there when he arrived. The boy looked older than before, though not in years. In attention, in the way his eyes tracked movement before it happened. Edith stood at the edge of the crowd, holding Elswythe's hand. Martin hovered beside her, restless. Oswin stood near the well again, but his posture had changed since Halric's arrival weeks earlier. Less sharp, more careful, as if he had learned that authority now came with oversight rather than certainty. Halric arrived shortly after, as always, without urgency. Behind him came a single clerk and 2 guards. The crowd quieted immediately. Halric stopped at the center of the square. He did not greet them. He rarely did. Instead, he spoke. "Assessment period is complete." A slight shift moved through the villagers. Aldric felt Edith tense from across the square. Halric continued. Brackenholt will be classified as stable. No celebration followed. No relief. Only a faint sense of release from uncertainty. Then Halric added, "Stability does not imply completion. That removed whatever comfort had begun forming. The clerk wrote quickly. Oswin remained silent. Halric's gaze moved across the crowd. Adjustments will remain in effect until further notice. A man near the front called out cautiously. What adjustments? Halric answered without hesitation. Output-based rationing, labor rotation, resource tracking. Nothing new, only continued structure. But now it was official. Permanent temporary systems, the most enduring kind. Hugh leaned slightly toward Aldric. So nothing changes, he murmured. Aldric didn't answer immediately, because something had changed, just not in the way people usually expected change to appear. Halric turned slightly toward Oswin. Local oversight status. Oswin cleared his throat. Fully compliant, he said. A pause, then added carefully. Resistance minimal. Halric nodded. Continue as planned. Then something unexpected happened. Halric did not leave immediately. Instead, his gaze stopped briefly on Aldric again. Longer than before, as if recalling something not fully filed away. You were present during disruption events, Halric said. Aldric nodded. Yes. Halric studied him for a moment. Your village did not collapse. It was not praise, not observation of success, just classification of outcome. Aldric replied cautiously. We nearly did. Halric accepted that, without contradiction, then said, Most systems do. That sentence hung strangely in the air. Not comforting, not threatening, just factual. Hugh frowned slightly. What systems? He asked before thinking better of it. Halric looked at him. All of them that rely on people. Silence followed. Even Oswin looked uncertain for a moment, because the statement did not distinguish between manor, village, quarry, or anything else. It included everything. Halric continued. Stability is not absence of collapse. It is management of it. Aldric felt something uneasy form in his chest again, because that definition matched what he had lived through too closely. Collapse had not disappeared. It had simply been contained, redirected, measured. Halric finally turned to leave, but before doing so, he added one final instruction. Prepare for surplus collection. A murmur spread instantly. That phrase was familiar. Too familiar. Surplus meant one thing. If you had more than survival required, it would be redistributed elsewhere. Edith stepped forward slightly. Surplus, she called out. Halric paused, but did not turn fully. Yes, after winter, we have barely enough for ourselves, she said. Halric replied calmly. Then there will be no surplus. And with that, he walked away. The guards followed. The clerk finished writing and left shortly after, and the square slowly returned to motion. But not fully, because people were thinking again. Not about survival, not about work, but about definition. What counted as enough? What counted as excess? What counted as belonging to them versus belonging to the system above them? That evening, Aldric stood outside the hut again. The wind was softer now, almost warm. Hugh approached quietly and sat beside him on the broken stone again, as he often did now. "I think I understand Halric," Hugh said. Aldric glanced at him. "Go on." Hugh picked at the ground. "He doesn't think he's ruling us." Aldric nodded slowly. "No, he thinks he's maintaining us." Aldric exhaled. "Yes." Hugh looked up. "Is there a difference?" Aldric stared at the horizon, at fields being replanted, at smoke rising steadily from repaired homes, at a village that no longer collapsed, but also no longer chose its direction. "Yes," Aldric said finally. Hugh waited. Aldric continued quietly. "One of them stops when people stop agreeing. A pause. The other stops when people stop existing." Silence followed. Not dramatic, just heavy and real. Somewhere behind them, Brackenholt continued rebuilding itself into something that would not break again easily. And that, Aldric realized, might be the most dangerous kind of stability there was. The first true warmth of spring arrived without celebration. It simply replaced the cold. Brackenholt did not notice it as an event. There were no bells, no gathering, no declaration that hardship had ended. Instead, the ground softened, the air loosened, and work continued exactly as it had before, only now with less frost on the hands. Aldric felt that change most during the early mornings, not in comfort, but in continuity. The same fields, the same assignments, the same measured routines that Halric's system had embedded into the village like woven thread. Even the memory of the fire had begun to settle into something less immediate. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but organized into the past, stored alongside other disasters that no longer interrupted daily survival. Aldric stood near the repaired fence line one morning, tightening bindings on a wooden post. Hugh worked beside him. The boy had grown quieter still in the months since winter. Not withdrawn, but focused in a way that made him seem older than his body suggested, as if attention itself had replaced innocence. For a long stretch neither of them spoke. The rhythm of labor filled the silence. Then Hugh finally broke it. "Do you think this is what peace is supposed to look like?" he asked. Aldric did not answer immediately. He looked across the village. Smoke rose evenly from chimneys. People moved with purpose between assigned areas. Even children carried small tasks now, not because they were forced sharply, but because it had been built into expectation. Everything functioned. Nothing overflowed. Nothing collapsed. "I don't think peace has a shape," Aldric said at last. Hugh frowned slightly. "Then what is this?" Aldric tightened another rope. Maintenance. The word hung between them longer than expected. Hugh nodded slowly, as if he had already suspected the answer. Aldric continued. "Peace sounds like something that arrives and stays," he said. "This doesn't stay. It is kept. Hugh glanced toward the central square. Aldric had not visited in several days, but his presence remained everywhere, in ledgers, in routines, in the way villagers corrected themselves before mistakes became visible. People don't talk about the fire anymore, Hugh said quietly. Aldric nodded. They don't need to. That was the strange part. Not forgetting, but absorbing. The fire had not been erased from memory. It had been absorbed into structure. A lesson rather than a rupture. A warning rather than a wound. At midday, a small caravan arrived from the manor hill. Not soldiers this time. Not tax collectors in force, but clerks and supply overseers carrying sealed records. They moved through Brackenholt with calm efficiency, checking grain stores, livestock counts, and labor assignments. Aldric noticed how little attention they drew now. Once their arrival had meant fear. Now it meant adjustment. Edith passed by carrying a bundle of repaired cloth. Elswith walked beside her more steadily now. Her illness long faded, but leaving a lingering fragility in her steps. Martin ran ahead briefly, then slowed when called back. Life had become structured enough that even children knew the boundaries of movement. Hugh watched them pass. You think they'll ever leave? He asked. Aldric followed his gaze toward the clerks. No, he said. Why? Aldric considered the question. Because nothing here required absence anymore. They don't need to leave, he said finally. They only need to update. Hugh frowned. That sounds worse. Aldric nodded once. It is. Later that day, Oswin approached them near the storage huts. His posture had changed again since winter. Less rigid, more cautious, like a man who had learned that authority survived better when it stopped pretending to be absolute. You're assigned to road maintenance rotation next week, he said to Aldric. Aldric nodded. Noted. Oswin hesitated briefly, then added, quieter than before, It's stable now. Aldric looked at him. Is it? Oswin didn't answer immediately. That silence itself was an answer, because stability, Aldric understood now, was not a statement. It was a description applied from above, not a condition felt equally by everyone beneath it. Oswin eventually turned and walked away. Hugh watched him go. He's different now, Hugh said. Aldric nodded. He's still Oswin, but smaller, Hugh said. Aldric considered that. Yes, that evening, Aldric sat outside his hut again, as he often did now. The village had grown quieter in a different way than winter silence. Not emptiness, not fear, but structured calm. Sounds had places now. Movements had purpose. Even arguments rarely escalated beyond correction. Edith sat inside, mending clothing by firelight. The children slept. Hugh arrived later and sat beside Aldric without speaking at first. They both watched the fields, green now, slowly returning. You ever think about leaving? Hugh asked suddenly. Aldric didn't respond immediately. question no longer carried the same meaning it once had. Leaving used to mean escape. Now it meant abandonment of structure. I used to think about it all the time, Aldric said. Hugh glanced at him. And now, Aldric looked across Brackenholt, at repaired roofs, at measured fields, at systems that no longer collapsed, but no longer loosened either. Now I think about what happens after you leave, he said. Hugh frowned. What happens? Aldric paused. Another place starts asking for the same things. Silence followed. Not hopeless, just observant, because neither of them had seen anything that contradicted it. After a while, Hugh spoke again. So nothing changes. Aldric exhaled slowly. No, he said, it changes shape. The wind moved gently across the village. Not cold anymore. Not sharp. Just steady. Hugh picked up a small stone and turned it in his fingers. I think I understand now, he said quietly. Aldric looked at him. What? Hugh stared at the fields. It never was about stopping suffering, he said. It was about deciding what kind of suffering lasts long enough to count as normal. Aldric didn't answer immediately, because that was too close to truth to dismiss. After a long silence, Aldric finally said, Then we're inside the version that lasts. Hugh nodded once. Yeah. They sat like that for a while. No urgency, no crisis, just the steady presence of a world continuing as it had been shaped to continue. Eventually, Hugh stood. I'm going to check the northern fence, he said. Aldric nodded. Go. Hugh hesitated for a moment, then added, Do you think it ends someday? Aldric watched him carefully, then looked toward Brackenholt, toward fields, toward roads, toward the faint line of the manor hill beyond the distance. I think, Aldric said slowly, it only ends when nothing is left to maintain. Hugh accepted that without argument, then walked away. Aldric remained outside as evening settled over the village. Behind him, Edith called softly from inside the hut. Dinner will be ready soon. He did not move yet, because for a moment he allowed himself to simply observe. Not fear, not hope, just structure. A village rebuilt not into freedom, not into ruin, but into continuity. Brackenholt still existed. The manor still existed. The quarry still existed somewhere beyond the hills. And somewhere above all of it, systems like Aldric's would continue expanding, not as conquest, but as management, until every small place learned the same language of survival. Measured, recorded, sustained, Aldric finally stood and turned toward the hut. Inside was warmth. Inside was family. Inside was life that continued, even when nothing truly changed. And Brackenholt, beneath a quiet sky, kept going. Not healed, not broken, but maintained. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.